Well, thank you, Warden, and thank you for inviting me to do this. It's daunting in two ways. I mean, one is that, of course, this long table, and I've discovered the fallacy of asking people if they can hear you, because if they can't, they don't know that I'm asking the question. I've never spoken in here before. Indeed, that's understandable, as it was a library, and I've never spoken in here at all. And the second way in which it's daunting is that there are so many highly intelligent and knowledgeable and experienced people here tonight. And I didn't really know what on earth I could say that you don't know already, or at least that wouldn't embarrass myself, because you knew it so well. And I thought that I really can't talk about the issues of Asian and African development of universities. I know something about Chinese universities. I know quite a lot about Hong Kong. I know something about Japan, and a little bit about South Africa, but the rest I don't know about. So that would embarrass me to talk about that, so I'm not going to. And I thought that maybe the best thing I could do was to try to talk about context, about some of the things that that might appear out of about what's going on in the world and how it affects universities. And you'll have to remember that I come from a long-established research university of the Western model, and that's where my experience is, and you will find me really talking about that, and I don't know how helpful that is to anybody who's concerned with most of what's going on in Africa. But I think the issues are quite general. And I think that what I'm going to try to do is to just pick up one or two themes out of contemporary change and try to see where they might lead us all. Okay? Of course, global change, the general context, is in rapid change. You know, I was talking to Max here about the contestations in UCT, and he mentioned social media. Well, I was vice chancellor, used to be vice chancellor about 10 years ago. I didn't have to worry about social media. So, you know, these things are challenging, and even in the detail like this, but I'm not going to talk so much about detail. I want to just give some notion of where I think we might be going. And of course, you will understand that I, as a historian, I'm going against every instinct of a historian, because we know that, as the finance people say, the past is no guide to the future. And Karl Marx is completely wrong. History does not repeat itself, and if it does, it doesn't repeat itself as farce, it repeats itself as tragedy. So, one last sort of preliminary point. The history of universities shows that they are immensely adaptable institutions. And whether we're talking about the development of the subjects of study, or the numbers, the massification in the last 70 years or so, the types of issues of study, the relationship with society and with government, all of these things show how plastic and how flexible universities are. But there are three caveats, I think. The first is that the pressures of change that we're seeing now may simply be accelerating inherent trends that are already there, or they may in fact be provoking complete renovation, complete change. And that's an open issue for many of these things. The second caveat is that this spread of ambient change so fast is leading to reactive governance of universities more than deeply strategic. There's a great deal of pursuit of tactical advantage within given situations on rather a short-term basis. I don't think that, though all my colleagues are, of course, admirable men and women who are running universities, admirable, I think that the pressures are really hard on them to deal with the present rather than to try to get their universities in shape for a longer-term future. And the third caveat is that we are, I think, coming out of what used to be a single or relatively unified sense of what a university is and what it's for. The world has been dominated by what one might call the Euro-American model, which has quite a good set of values, a sense also of the normativeness of campus-based education, that people gather. It's rather like a library. It used to be the simplest way to educate, to learn knowledge was to gather it as much as possible in one place and have people come into it. And within 15 to 20 years, that's completely reversed. The simplest way is to actually spread it onto everybody's desk. And that's a complete reversal which challenges libraries, particularly national libraries, as I was a chairman of one. It challenges them profoundly. And the same kind of challenge is in universities. This Euro-American Western model with its value systems, as I think was being said by Ruben this afternoon, I mean, that is vulnerable. Why should we assume that in the changing structures of the world, the kind of values that we drew from the Enlightenment are actually going to be the ones that will be preeminent in 50 years' time? We don't know. Hope so. Scientists all say, that science is never going to be challenged because it's based upon, empirical and so on. Really? A number of scientists I know say that their knowledge is very fragile, really, that what is only at the most simplest level can you are phenomena just simply repeatable. But there's so much knowledge that is relative, even in what I've always considered to be the, as it were, reliable subjects. So let me begin, I say, and I've already 5 minutes in, let me begin by stating some very obvious things. Be patient with me. We'll have to start there, but they are obvious, aren't they? That, first of all, that there are three great pressures at work on us now. And what I want to come from is to see where at least some of them might lead. The first is, of course, the digital revolution. The second is globalization, a nasty word, much contested, but it'll serve for the moment. And the third is the action of government, or the actions of governments. Now, all three of these great pressures have a dual quality. They provide transformative opportunities of enormous dimensions, and they also are great threats. And the dilemma for us in universities, I think, is to try to work out how we can take advantage of those opportunities of transformation of ourselves and transformation of knowledge, and avoid the threats. Now, what I'm really going to talk about is the threats. I'm a sort of glass half full, sort of, is it, or empty? The pessimist end, anyway. Yes, I don't think anybody's going to come and fill my glass when it's half something. The first of these, just to give a few examples of what I'm talking about. The first of these is the digital. This is the pressure whose long-term effects are, I think, the most difficult to see, because we don't know what transformations will be generated by the transformations that are already taking place as a result of the digital revolution. On the one hand, we've seen the transformation of the constituting, transmitting, and storing of knowledge, because universities and academics can extend and innovate prodigiously. It's extraordinary what people can do now with this. You know, I still hanker after, the small card which I take to the archives with me and laboriously copy things in, and I have these young people beside me who are photographing or simply scanning, and I don't know. Just puts off the evil day of reading it, is my view. But anyway. But there is a simultaneous threat, and I simply don't want to downplay the extraordinary power of that transformation. Don't think I don't recognize it, but I'm not going to talk about it. It's simultaneously, this threatens the settled patterns and coherence of universities, and most profoundly, most dangerously for my mind, their position as the main creators, verifiers, and definers of what useful knowledge is. It's opening the door to all sorts of alternatives, and that really is something we've got to be very careful about. Secondly, globalization. Who's going to deny the enormous power of networked endeavor, of collaboration in discovery, and the global flow of students and academics? It's fantastic. And when I first went to a conference in America, I was proud, I felt honored, I felt I was somebody special. I think that was in about 1966. No, you turn to your colleague at table and you say, I've just come back from La Jolla or somewhere. How long were you there? Oh, only 2 days. I mean, it's really completely different, but that's trivial perhaps. The trouble is that we're also seeing a new geography of power, of success, rather like the new economic geography that's appearing, a new geography of power, success, a new geography of sites of innovation, of competition and collaboration, in which the capacity to subvert our settled academic world is very obvious. Those at the top, so-called, may very well not be there in a foreseeable future. The trouble about being successful and at the top is that there's very little incentive to do something different until it's too late. And thirdly, the action of governments. That's the most complicated of these things, I think, at present. But it is, I think, the most direct vehicle of change by its effect on public policy and the use of public funding. And this is really where I want to begin, not because I hate governments or anything like that, but because this is really the simplest way through to where I want to go with you in the short time I've got. First of all, what we're seeing now is the justification of universities by economic relevance. This has become very visible since about 1980. Just as the Cold War ended, when we were used as the justification of proving that our society was better than the one that the others had, and governments became less interested in us. It was wonderful. Now suddenly we've got a new function. The reaction to the emerging new geography of power and economic success is the governments have come to believe that, probably rightly, higher skills are required in their population, more widely spread. Knowledge used to be closely held as an instrument of power, and now it's widely held, or should be widely held, as an instrument of power. It's a power for the society. So the belief has appeared that progress is in innovation, and essentially that innovation is in science, of which the idea is that the digital revolution was the product. And therefore the university is being assigned a crucial role in promoting economic prosperity, essentially through STEM, science, technology, engineering and medicine. The social value of the research university is now, in the dominant discourse, seen to be the social value of science, because the value of science is essentially an economic value, science and its applications. Governments are at present still quite unclear about the difference between science and the application of science, and long may they remain confused. But what we're seeing then is the concentration on science, technology, and so on. And therefore, the problem has become cost. The increasing emphasis on science and technology has produced the issue of who's going to pay. And because they are so expensive, we are increasingly vulnerable to being funded on government-chosen objectives. In other words, on things that are decided as important, whose importance is decided by outside ourselves, by people who don't share our values, objectives, and even processes. We've heard today, I can't remember which session it was in, but somebody said, and I thought very rightly, that this means that research-intensive universities will be state-funded. Harvard is indirectly state-funded through the big research, well, they're not called councils in the States, are they? I'm getting old. But things like the national endowments. So I don't want to imply in all I'm saying that everything will be the same everywhere, or that every change will happen at the same time. I'm just setting up a scenario, okay? But the consequence of that is, I think, first of all, the inevitable increasing regulation for value for money and for responsiveness to national objectives. The more it costs, the more the representatives of the taxpayers are going to say, we who represent the taxpayers want to be assured that you're giving us value for money and that you are in fact responding to the national interest which we've defined. The second consequence is that, therefore, the measurement of success becomes paramount, and hence we have the reliance on these league tables, which we all know inside universities are pretty flawed instruments, but which seem pretty convincing if you're in the Treasury. The third consequence is, I think, that we see now universities increasingly intent on hiring research leaders and research teams, producing a kind of worldwide movement of these people. And thus the search for success, as it were, has the potential of destabilizing both the internal coherence and the disciplinary balance of institutions. Those universities who are not getting enough have that translated into not getting enough money. And what they're going to do in the future is constrained by that. On the other hand, those who are in well-earning research areas prosper at the expense of the less so. And these things are true both between universities and inside universities. So what we're heading towards, it seems to me, is a fragmentation. And that fragmentation between those who succeed and those who don't, those who are earning the income and those who are not, is going to be accelerated because the high cost of doing these research, this sort of mandated research, is accelerating, and we are, in the end, inevitably going to end up with a system of what one might call preferred suppliers to the government's research plan. And therefore, there will be a further separation between a smaller and smaller group of successful and funded and the rest. But also, of course, the digital revolution is allowing much more complex and challenging questions to be asked by research across the board, from science through to humanities. Therefore, the answers to these questions are becoming increasingly difficult to find within one group or indeed one discipline, and hence the increasing emphasis on interdisciplinarity, the content of which, as a word, I find difficult to discern. It's very nice for the funders to say, oh, you're not interdisciplinary enough, so we'll give this to somebody else. So everybody's scrambling to use these words. What they actually mean is another matter. I mean, there's a difference between interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. And also, if we're all interdisciplinary, what happens to the disciplines? You know, some stuff is actually pretty straightforwardly rooted in the middle of physics, isn't it? I mean, you know. It's good to, we're moving, I think, towards multi-group, multidisciplinary endeavour, or the emphasis on it. And that's also true that we cannot get the answers to these things within just one institution. So we're beginning to see the growth of what we've been hearing about today in some of the groups, of collaborations and of partnerships, which become more and more structured, more and more structural, more and more inbred into the funding structure. And if you add to this what I would call the triumph of research, which is also reaching its apogee now, which is in itself a major change. When I set out at the beginning of the 1960s, oh, my bones are creaking. When I set out at the beginning of the 1960s to do an academic career, there was only a minority of us who thought that you got a doctorate and that this was necessary. The really clever ones went straight in, got hired directly. People like me who were not quite so clever had to get a PhD. People who worked in universities thought that research was interesting, that it was a good thing to do, but their primary task was to teach. Research was a kind of sort of private interest, really. I'm exaggerating a bit, but if you go back to the 30s or the 20s, you've got some big science being done in German universities, for example, but it was mostly the product of curiosity, of a very clever people trying to think their way through basic problems. They weren't the defining aspect of universities. Now we actually talk, as you've been talking today, about research universities as a whole category. And anybody who's not in a research university, or anybody's institution is not a research university, is desperately trying to appear as if they are. So, I think that's a major change, and I don't really know what the outcome of that is going to be, except to say that it's based upon institutional validation in the eyes of the governments and in the eyes of league tables, and it's based also, more perniciously, upon individual validation. Academics now validate themselves not by how well their students turn out, but by the citation index and by what their colleagues think of them, which is really a change over the last 40 years. So more and more people are validating themselves by research with a concomitant devaluation of those who can't. Therefore, I think we're looking towards a future of increased stratification, with the numbers of real research universities declining, both as the funding contracts, the preferred supplier appears, the league tables pick this up, and individuals lose increasingly their, I think, one of the big parts of their vocation, but above all are losing their loyalty to institutions and are looking more outwards to other connections, other sorts of relationship. At the same time, we're seeing the internal incoherence appearing with these wandering researchers, and we see an increasing national incoherence as, it seems to me, a national university system becomes decreasingly relevant. We see the international flow of students, we see the international flow of academics, we see the growth of relationships, of partnerships, and I think we're going to see more and more universities, particularly the more high-achieving universities, getting themselves locked into multilateral relationships, into partnerships which transcend borders, just as their students are increasingly transborder. And you wonder what a national system of higher education is going to look like. For as long as the government is the main source of funding, there'll always be that. But whether governments can afford the kind of cost that this presents us now is very debatable. And we're going to see more and more of these big projects being done internationally with international funds like the European Research Council and so on, and the big funding sources outside. So, I mean, I could go on about these threats. For example, the international flow of students seems to me to be, first of all, what is sustaining the current structure of research in major research universities, but it strikes me as being incredibly unstable. It's unstable because of the changing flows depending upon fashion and fear to some extent. Look what happened in Australia when incoming students were beaten up, had trouble. There's an immediate drop of the flow. But I think also much more unstable in the long term. I mean, as home universities become more and more competent, have better and better undergraduate education, and then better and better graduate education, there's less and less incentive to go to places like the United States or Europe. What will, I think, happen more and more is that people will come for skilling. They'll come for maybe MA degrees, maybe we'll sell them as MA degrees, but they will be specific skills, specifically targeted benefits that people can't get locally or which are better made, better got abroad. So we can see the same sorts of fragmentations appearing, for example, with the growth of online education. I myself don't think that online universities will ever displace residential universities, but I think they're going to take quite a large part of the market, and that is going to challenge quite a large number of much less well endowed, much less well managed, much less well successful universities. So what I'm talking about really is the multiple possibilities of fragmentation and the multiple possibilities of incoherence that are set within our current situation. Whether they'll come to reality or not, I don't know. I mean, it depends very much on how universities conduct themselves, what kind of leadership they have. But I think that the basic existential threat is the loss by universities and the wider society of a sense of the essential functions of universities. And I read something about this recently, well, not that recently, and in a way I don't think I can say it any differently from what I said there. So if you don't mind, I'm going to quote myself. I think the first problem with the current definitions of research universities and the ways in which they are funded and the ways in which they are perceived outside university is that this is not how research and discovery works. The core function of a university is to create knowledge and transmit it together with our inherited knowledge, which we have, each generation verifies before handing it on. Universities define what knowledge is, what useful knowledge is, on the basis of rules of evidence and critical reasoning. The current preoccupation with short-term horizons, with immediate knowledge and its applications, is simply to fasten, I think, on a byproduct. The creation of new knowledge really depends, whether you're in the humanities, the social sciences, or the sciences, it depends upon a culture and individual attitudes that value curiosity, skepticism, serendipity, creativity, and genius. The nature of research is that its outcome is basically unpredictable. If you knew what you were going to find, you wouldn't go and look for it. So it's the freedom to speculate, to go look, to imagine, to notice details, to indulge in wonder that produces the future. If you destroy that, you really impoverish the future, I think. Universities deal in big questions, whatever the discipline involved. The vitality of universities lies in the constant recognition of the instability of meaning, not the certainty of discovery, the instability of meaning, revisited generation by generation. The instability of knowledge, the constant questioning, the unremitting search for new understanding across the whole spectrum of disciplines. I think the differences in objects and procedures of study shouldn't disguise that all academics, whether in research or teaching, are essentially engaged in the same process of constituting knowledge, the same process of discovery. Whether by discovery you mean uncovering the previously unknown, or by refining what we think we know by reinterpretation, it's the same process of understanding what we previously did not understand. And we do that for the whole of society. We're not the only people who do it, but we are the principal vehicle of that happening. And I think that all domains are complementary, or we're all mutually sustaining within the general purpose. In broad terms, the whole of university activity is capable of bringing practical improvement to the human condition. It's ridiculous to say it's only medicine or it's only the building of bridges. Universities are about establishing true understanding, about putting, our product is the students we put out into the world, it seems to be. And I think really the contemporary observer has got to remain pretty anxious about the ability of universities to protect these essential functions of the definition and transmission of knowledge through this period of both the predictable and unpredictable transformations of this advancing century. For my money, universities alone are the bulwark against systems of pseudo-knowledge based on unverified sources and fantasies of meaning. And the last century demonstrated clearly enough not only the panic, hatred, and devastation that derived from such ignorance, but also how universities could be intimidated and suborned in their functions. Yet, and this is the final point, ultimately only universities can protect their own importance. No one much from outside is going to help us, for there's so much to covet in universities, from power and the perversion of principles through to product. And it requires, I think, intelligent, principled and firm leadership, supported by academics who understand the issues, and they have to be trained in that, and who do not cling to every form of the past for fear of the future. So I end on a pretty pessimistic note, don't I? I'm sorry about that.